the rest of the second session of this workshop today. So it's my pleasure to have three speakers, introduce three speakers today. Stefano will begin with an introduction to Software Heritage project, and also identify some of the collaborative opportunities between the two projects, Software Heritage and BOA. Stefano, we can see your slides. You can go ahead and get started.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
So thanks for having me. I'm Stefano Zacchiroli from University de Paris in France, and I'm the co-founder of the Software Heritage project, which is what I'm going to talk to you about today. So to begin with, so the key notion of Software Heritage is that we are an archive. And the ambitious idea is to collect all the software source code we can find together with its development history. So think of a sort of internet archive for VCSs. So Git, not only Git, but for version control systems in general. So we started with three different use cases in mind, which is important to understand, even though only one is relevant for the application field of BOA, let's say. So the first one was to have some sort of reference catalog which indexes all the software source code which is out there, because that is very relevant for several industrial use cases related to security and software provenance. Second point was preserving source code because it contains valuable human information. It's human knowledge that is embedded in software. It is available only in its source code form. It is important not to lose it. So Robert mentioned before that forges come and go, so like Google Code or Gitorius or other forges that disappeared in the past, and it's important not to risk losing the source code that they were hosting. And the third point, which is what is relevant for BOA, is that we aim to be a research infrastructure, and actually with two different angles. So one angle is similar to what BOA is doing. So the idea is having an infrastructure where researchers can go and make their own experiments in a reproducible way. And the second angle is being an important missing leg of open science, which is a permanent place where researchers can deposit their source code. So I don't remember if that was one of the points that Gregorio made in it, but for sure it has been made in others about reproducibility. So the key reason why experiments are not reproducible is because the source code used for running the experiment is no longer available. So that was the idea of making a basic building block where you can deposit source code if you're a researcher and make sure you will find it there. Because stuff like GitHub is not an archive. Why you need a proper archive, like you have archives for papers, to make sure your software will be available later on when someone checks your paper. So that's not very relevant for today, but just to say that we're just not only a research project, it's also an institutional project backed by several institutions. So we are backed by the UNESCO, the United Nations, by several non-profits from science and from the free and open source software world. And we have a bunch of sponsors, both from institutional partners like governments and also from major companies in the IT field. The key difference, I think, between the way we store software and the way BOA does that is the data model. So essentially, we have a giant data model in which we duplicate everything, and the data model is a Merkle DAG. So the Merkle DAG is formed by file contents and directories, similar to inodes in Unix file systems. Then you have revisions, which are essentially commits, and then you have repository snapshots, which is the state where each repository is at the time of archival. So if you're familiar with the data model of Git, this is very similar, but essentially it's like we're building a giant Git repository of all the software we can find. And so the idea is that if we find the same file in a gazillion different commits, we store it only once. If we find the same commit in 1,000 different forked repositories, we save it only once. And that is true even across different software storage technologies. So the same code is maintained both in Git and in Mercurial or in Subversion, maybe due to different migration from one system to another, we store it only once. So this adds complexity, but if you think at the ambitious goal of keeping, source code around like in the very long term, potentially forever, it's going to pay back when technology evolve and when code moves from one data host place to another. In terms of automation and crawling, we're basically like a big crawler for source code. So we do not crawl the entire web. We wouldn't have the resources to do that. So we start from specific places. Usually we start from well-known forages, well-known source distributions, and repositories of package managers. And we periodically list all the stuff is available there. We make a list of all the places in there we can retrieve source code from. And periodically, we crawl each of those places. So we crawl individual Git repository, Mercurial repositories, packages in Debian, or packages on NPM and PyPy and so on and so forth. And we visit those places and we retrieve new stuff which we have never seen before, and we store them in our giant Mercurial tab. So the data model is uniform, which means essentially you can traverse the history of software source code, no matter the technology that was used to develop them and distribute them to individual forages. It's not just a theory; it's an archive that exists today. So these numbers are a bit old now, maybe a few months old. So we now have archived more than 10 billion unique source code files, because remember that everything is deduplicated. I think we have recently passed the threshold of 2 billion unique commits, and we have archived more than 150 million projects. We have the major data sources that you see in this slide, and some more that you can find on our website. So we have GitHub, we have GitLab, we have Bitbucket, we have some forages that no longer exist, like Google Code and Gitorious. We have some distributions like Debian, NPM, CRAN, PyPy, and so on and so forth. So it's pretty big. It's the blob storage for the files is about 400 terabytes if you uncompress. So it compresses like a factor of 2, so it's still more than 200 terabytes. And the graph itself is pretty big. So it's now in the ballpark of 20 billion nodes and 300 billion edges in terms of a Mercurial tab. So it is today the largest publicly available archive on free and open source software. So just a few selected highlights in the kind of research we do around this. So the first article on this slide is just the general philosophical presentation of the project. And the second one is right now our best approximation at how we allow researchers to do studies on our dataset. So basically in this MSR 2019 paper, we have released the structure of the graph itself, not of the files, just of the graph for now, as a dataset, which can be imported into either large databases or some clusters for doing essentially analysis of individual type of objects, individual commits, individual directory structure, individual release, and so on and so forth. But you need to have yourself the infrastructure where to import the dataset in order to analyze it. We're working on some compression techniques to make the graph fit in memories. So we're in the senior paper, we've shown how we can use essentially web graph compression techniques to compress our DAG and fit it in memory and analyze it, for instance, as a network in a single machine. And then we have done some large-scale analysis, for instance, on forks, because the main advantage of our data model is that essentially you have a global view of the entire state of the software commons, which is something that you cannot have if you keep your repository separated, essentially. And you have also done some very large-scale analysis on how to keep track of where software comes from, essentially. So my main pitch and the most interesting idea that we can work on together is essentially that we have common interests, we have common needs. Our own, let's say, research-facing view is not as advanced as what you have in BOA. Most notably, we don't have a runtime or infrastructure to allow researchers to run their experiments. We would like to have it. And in particular, we would like to have a filtering language, essentially, that allows to select the project you want to analyze based on metadata of projects that we also mine. We'd like to have essentially an implementation language to define experiments, very similar to in spirit and functionality to what you have in BOA. The runtime for those experiments on top of some infrastructure, we could be either a single machine, a cluster, or a cloud where you can pay for resources. We do not add, and I think it would be interesting to explore essentially porting the BOA language and runtime to our data model, and there might be some key advantages there. And one is indeed that we can exploit sharing. So we natively sharing when traversing our DAG, which is one global DAG and not one tree per project, you will re-encounter the same node. Could be a file, could be a commit in many different contexts. And when you do that, you can reuse results from previous experiments. I understand, Robert, very well that this appear not to be needed for BOA, but it's definitely needed at our scale. So that would be an evolution of the runtime, which sounds interesting. And the last one is that we know that crawling is a pain for everyone. So we are already crawling, and we have to do that for digital preservation purposes. We can give access to our archive via our mirroring technology to other, then it could be leveraged by BOA essentially as a corpus, probably larger for what we have now for researchers. So that's what I have. I would like to give some minutes for discussion. Unfortunately, I will not be able to remain for the breakout session because it's gonna get late here and I have no kids to take care of. But yeah, I'm also available via email to discuss more if you're interested.
Thank you. Thank you, Stefano, for this. This is very very exciting. So you had in the earlier part of this this workshop, Robert shared the data model that that BOA uses. Do you think that based on your initial initial intuitions, whether there might be significant changes necessary for this kinds of integration to work, or?
In the data model and in the language, probably not, because you're already using a functional kind of language, which is great, because also, we also have a big graph. So the functional approach and it's already the very good one for doing that. I think the difficult part is in the runtime below that, because aside from improvements like caching, if you want to distribute computation, you kind of need to break down your graph into essentially subgraphs, which are amenable for distribution to several machines. So we are studying the structure of the graph. So we think we know how to break it into several parts which can be distributed, and avoiding, jumping too much from one machine to another. But that kind of partition is probably the most tricky part, because I'm guessing you're just distributing one repository to each machine you have in your cluster, I'm assuming. And that works well for if you do like project analysis. But if your entire data model is integral, you first need to essentially partition your graph, works well distributed, and then do the computation. So I think that's the most challenging part. But so, in my opinion, a very interesting research problem. So.
Definitely, that most certainly makes sense. Sorry, I was muted there before. Any other questions for Stefano? I don't want to hog up all the time here. Okay. I'm sorry you won't be here for the breakout, but I look forward to having a follow-up discussion with you on this matter. This is definitely a very interesting opportunity for us to work together and facilitate some of our goals. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you again.
Thanks.
Yep.